Hello, class, and welcome to Interviewing Techniques. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and this week we will be exploring the theme of identifying behavioral discrepancies. Um, this is really a powerful technique in motivational interviewing and counseling, the whole skill of identifying behavioral discrepancies. Now, this technique helps clients become aware of how their current behaviors conflict with their goals, with their values, or identities. Now, this doesn't mean fixing, this means helping them to identify. So, when this is done with empathy and with skill, it can spark motivation. And this then promotes meaningful change. Remember, you want to go slow, you want them to make the choices, and so you are simply helping them to identify behavioral discrepancies. This isn't about confrontation. This is about holding up a gentle mirror and helping them to look at what is going on within their lived world and how they are impacting their lived world. As always, within my lectures, I want to start off with a little story about someone important, and then we will dive into a couple of our three main themes for this lecture. The first one is I want you to understand the concept of discrepancy in behavior and values. We'll then dive into some techniques for raising discrepancy in counseling sessions. And then we'll look at how we can use the identification of those discrepancies to enhance the client's motivation for change in the counseling session. So there are, first off, understanding the concept, then what are the techniques for raising the discrepancies, and then how can we use that in our connected relationship with the client in their lived world to help them to enhance their motivation for change. So remember, we're not telling, we're not fixing, we are reflecting, and we are inviting and evoking. So, today's story and person that I'd like to highlight is James Prochansky. James Prosant, sorry, James Prochaska was a psychologist who was best known for the model of behavioral change. It was what we call the trans-theoretical model for change, or the stages of change model. Really, a huge part of his research was just to help clarify how people move into a state of change from being stuck where they are. James Prochaska was born in 1942. Unfortunately, he died in 2024. But his legacy is pretty powerful because he helped us first to recognize that people move from their state of being stuck through to a state of readiness for change. And that oftentimes this transition from being stuck to a readiness for change is not a linear thing. And it can go through several cycles. Prochaska's work really kind of emphasizes that we need to identify the internal conflict and recognize that there is internal conflict going on. And a lot of that conflict has to do with between where a client is and where a client wants to be. And that is a vital part of motivating progress. His theories strongly influence, then, of course, motivational interviewing, and of course, are going to influence addictions counseling practice overall, because it's all about change and dealing with that internal conflict, particularly when it comes to addictions counseling. And so that is all extremely powerful and extremely important. So remember that name, James Prochaska, and his work on changing for good, the trans-theoretical model of behavioral change. So, as we have already discussed a little bit, discrepancy is a huge part of the techniques for interviewing. Discrepancy is that gap between a client's current behavior and their future goals or their current values. What is going on there? What is the disconnect between these two things? And there's always a little bit of a disconnect within us. And the important thing here is to be slow, to be patient, and to ask gentle questions. When clients recognize this gap for themselves without us pointing it out, they often begin to consider change much more seriously. They take ownership of this discrepancy. They realize that this discrepancy is what is causing tension within their life. Discrepancy creates not only cognitive tension, but emotional tension, as well as tension in the external world. So, when we recognize that discrepancy, the next step then is to help them supportively to become an energy of transformation and helping them to move beyond that discrepancy, to help them to explore choices that they can make to reduce that discrepancy in some way. Now, the question is, why does discrepancy work? Well, it's because humans really want to live in peace. We all want to have peace within our lives. And sometimes we don't want to admit that, but we really do want it. We seek internal consistency. In fact, it's very difficult to be happy without internal consistency. And we all want happiness. So when we act against our own values or against our own goals, we feel tension. Discrepancy then allows clients to see this tension without being overwhelmed by shame and defensiveness. Remember, we are in their lived world, being gentle, reducing shame, so that they can see that discrepancy for themselves. And it brings awareness to the contradiction and then invites them to reflect upon it. And here's the key. The counselor is not pointing out failure. You are inviting the client to notice the contrast in their own words. And you're doing it slowly and you're doing it gently. It's not a, aha, I got you. It is a slow, gentle questioning and inviting and inviting the client to notice the contrast in their own words and in their own choices. So there's some techniques for raising discrepancy. One of the ways is to use what we call the double-sided reflections. So on one hand, you want to stop drinking, but on the other hand, you feel like that is your only relief. So you can ask an evocative question. So how does that align with what you told me about wanting to be a better parent? And then you are simply exploring the values, like what's most important to you right now, and helping them to clarify all of that will then help them to find a place where they are starting to make choices that reduce that tension. And in all of this, remember, what you're trying to do in raising discrepancy is to let the client hear the gap. You're doing this gently, but you're doing it clearly, you're doing it empathetically, and you're doing it compassionately. And of course, you are avoiding defensiveness. You are not raising shame. The key to raising discrepancy without triggering shame is two things: it's tone and it is timing. Soften the tone, keep the timing slow. Don't say, "But you said you wanted to stop." Instead, say it like this: "How do you feel about the way that choice lined up with your goals?" See the difference? Let the client do the evaluating. Your job is to reflect and to ask, not to judge, not to correct. Again, let the client do the evaluating. Your job is to evoke within the client, not to judge, not to correct. Remember, the principle here is that they indeed do want to change. They want their life to be better. But there are other conflicting things going on within them, and it's for them to identify those. They are the expert. So how do we work with resistance? Because sometimes when discrepancy is raised, clients push back. And remember, as a counselor, this is not a failure. This is an expected part of the process. You might hear them say something like, I don't care anymore, or, it's too late for me. Your job in that situation is, again, empathy and evoking. Same as always. You might say something like this: "Part of you feels like giving up." That makes sense. It's exhausting trying to change. And then you might gently reconnect to their earlier hopes and their earlier values and other things that they've said that do bring hope and change. So, in all of this, remember, you're going slow. There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be frustration. There's going to be exhaustion. That's okay. That's part of the process. Change is not easy for anyone. Here's an example of some dialogue. The client might say something like, "I want to stop using, but I just bought some again last night." And you as a counselor might say something like this in response: "You're really wanting to quit, and at the same time you find yourself repeating old patterns." Or the client might say something like this: "I promised my daughter I'd stay sober, and I didn't." You as the counselor might say something like, "That promise meant a lot to you, and now it feels like you've let her down." Okay? See there, you're reflecting back, and you're also raising the discrepancy so that they can hear it. You're not pointing it out. You're identifying what they've already said and reinforcing that discrepancy, honoring the client's emotional truth. And that's fine. That is what we should be doing. And so, of course, discrepancy is not the same thing as change talk. There needs to be a bit of a transition in there. And so, because the goal of raising discrepancy is not to push the client anywhere, but it's to bring up within the client that idea of change talk. You want to evoke change talk. And this includes any statement that shows desire or ability or reason or hope or need for change. So you're looking for, as you're bringing up these discrepancies, does the client show any desire for change? Are they showing any ability for change? Are they showing any reason for change? Are they showing any need for change? Are they showing any hope for change? So there comes a time when you transition from discrepancy highlighting to change talk. And you can vacillate back and forth over sessions, and that's perfectly fine. This is not a linear process, remember. But when discrepancy lands, clients often say things like, I have to figure this out, or I hate living like this, or I can't keep doing this to them. And your job there is simply to affirm and reflect that. Because with those kinds of statements are the seeds for transformation. It's at that point that you can see the client starting to move from discrepancy identity to change talk. And as they move to change talk, then you know you're starting to move to a different phase within your counseling relationship. Again, it's going to go through cycles. You are going to have setbacks, there's no doubt about it. But in the midst of that, you are also going to have some change. And that is what we're hoping for. So, as we close up this lecture, I want to kind of highlight a few key terms. First one is, when we talk about discrepancy, what are we talking about? We are talking about that gap between current behavior and the stated goals or values that the client has. When we talk about change talk, we're talking about the client's language that favors movement towards change. And when we speak of the double-sided reflection, we are using that technique to capture the ambivalence and the discrepancies that are going on within the client. Now, as far as our quiz question, what is the primary purpose of raising discrepancy in a counseling session? Well, the primary purpose there is, of course, to create awareness and motivation for change. So as we close out, I want to encourage you to remember that raising discrepancy is not about catching clients in contradictions. It's not about highlighting the gotcha or I told you so. It's about guiding them to hear the truth that they already know. And that can be part of the frustrating process of counseling, is they already know the answer, but they need to be able to live it. And that is why you are in their lived world to start with. You're not there to provide the answers. You're there to provide connection and support. So this week, I want you to pay attention to when people use their words and their behaviors don't align, and to help reflect on that in a gentle way, to ask them how it feels, and to stay present. When clients feel safe to confront their own contradictions without shame, real transformations start to begin. So I encourage you to keep practicing that art of gentle mirroring, to highlight the discrepancies, to help the client to evoke those discrepancies so that you can mirror them back and that you can slowly move towards more congruence within the client's life. Because with congruence comes healing and comes eventual happiness. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.